When the White Scars engaged their enemies without mercy, they did so not out of a mere desire for bloodshed, but as an homage to the valor demonstrated by their adversaries. They believed in holding nothing back against a worthy opponent, a practice that stemmed from their respect for the nobility of combat. Their disregard for the strategies and protocols of others was primarily rooted in their belief that their methods were more effective. Rarely did they ever challenge others' methods directly. Instead, they let their results speak for themselves to the validity of their approach. The White Scars prized courtesy and straightforward honesty over rigid adherence to protocol, often finding conventional rules of battle ill-suited for the chaos of real-world combat. Nevertheless, they were uncompromising in enforcing their own standards and punishing transgressions within their ranks, never overstepping the bounds by accusing someone of another legion in the same way they would their own. Despite their values and skills, the White Scars often found themselves largely marginalized amongst their peers. Many of their fellow Primarchs viewed them with some amount of disdain or suspicions, as the other legions, particularly those of Dorn and Guilliman, criticized the White Scars' unconventional tactics and the Chigoran traditions that unified them. Jaghatai Khan, known for his reserved nature and his preference for isolation, did little to alter these perceptions, maintaining his distance from those who misjudged his legion. Amongst his brothers, the Khan of Khans found solidarity with only a few. One of the most notable examples would be Magnus the Red of Prospero, who, like Jaghatai Khan, was an outcast within the Primarch's inner circles, and shared his values of integrity along with blunt honesty. Horus was also among those who valued capabilities over appearances, and actively showed some amount of favor towards Jaghatai Khan, as did Sanguinius, who was known for his diplomatic acumen amongst his often contentious siblings, to the point that during the Heresy, Sanguinius would implicitly trust Jaghatai Khan's instincts. The historical records provide scant details about Jaghatai's interactions with the other Primarchs, sans some rather notorious ribbing given towards Fulgrim of the Emperor's children. Often most records would reflect his infrequent appearances at gatherings where the number of Primarchs was limited. Much like his legion, Jaghatai Khan was perpetually in motion, strategically placing himself at crucial points to influence battles and shape the outcome of conflicts. However, as the Great Crusade neared its conclusion in the early 31st millennium, the White Scars found their role diminishing, as the Imperium had at last subdued its major rivals and explored most of the galaxy, rendering the vast untamed spaces where the White Scars thrived increasingly scarce. In these final years, the Imperium structure became more organized and significantly more predictable. The White Scars then would face a stark choice. Their thrill for combat and the pursuit of the unknown, which had once driven them, was actively fading. The prospect of continuing in a more orderly and predictable role left them with a sense of unending obsolescence. The Khan of Khans understood that the end of the Great Crusade brought with it a choice of profound consequence. The White Scars would need to choose between reasserting their old chaotic ways, a choice that would entail betraying their hard-earned achievements, or resigning themselves to a gradual decline within the new order of the Imperium. In the later years of the 800s within the 30th millennium, the White Scars had firmly established their reputation for certain types of warfare, which would become iconic to them later, as their legacy would further be developed in the 31st millennium and into the 40th. Yet their campaigns were not fought strictly in isolation. At key engagements such as Tyrell III, Jakor Tau, Turklin B3, the White Scars operated as part of combined Legion Astartes expeditionary forces, collaborating with other legions, including the Ultramarines, who often found themselves at odds with the White Scars, and the Emperor's children, whom's Primarch would often butt heads with Jaghatai Khan. The battle honor of Arco, earned at a significant joint operation, would be carried by all these legions, including the now dubious Sons of Fulgrim. Through the tumult of the Horus Heresy and into the era of the Great Scouring, the animosity between the White Scars and the Emperor's children would continue to build. A notable battle honor that would be recognized long after the Horus Heresy by both the Loyalist and the Traitor factions would be earned at Durin in 881 M30. Durin was a desolated world situated in the spine ward of the Morpheus Rift, which had become a battleground for a monumentous imperial compliance effort, where 3 legions, the Luna Wolves, the Death Guard, and the White Scars, assembled all under their primarchs, were sent to assert the imperial truth upon this region. The unity and scale of this force was in essence unprecedented in the Great Crusade's history. As the legions approached the gates of Durin's capital, they found them firmly barred and barricaded. The lack of response from the city's defenders was met with growing frustrations as Horus prepared to breach the gates with his mighty mace. However, before he could act, Kuleksen, a stormseer of the White Scars, intervened with a foreboding warning which went as follows. The shadow hangs over this place, the shadow of domination. Only death will sever the strings. Despite his warnings and the ominous counsel, the Primarch of the Death Guard, Mortarion, urged Horus to disregard the warnings and continue the assault. Horus, undeterred and filled with pride, struck at the gates with such force that they buckled inwards, collapsing in a cloud of dust. The legions would then advance into the city, only to encounter a scene of profound decay. The city's inhabitants were a grotesque sight, their eyes vacant, their mouths slack, their bodies now clad in filthy rags, showing signs of long neglect and suffering. As the legions moved through the desolate streets, the Stormseer renewed his warnings with an increasing urgency that was unheeded, since yet again his concerns were actively dismissed by Mortarion, who, due to his long-held distaste for psychers, mocked his insights. This time, however, Jaghatai Khan would interject, insisting that Horus heed his Stormseer's caution. The Great Khan's intervention marked a rare moment of unity amongst the Primarchs, acknowledging the gravity of the situation and the potential consequences of their actions. As the legions advanced through the city, now much more carefully, it became increasingly apparent that there was a danger, in particular when a churning vortex of unnatural energies began to form above the city. As the vortex eye hovered directly above the city's center, they would hear a deep, resonant groan emerging from the gathered masses below. Retreating from the city, the Primarchs regrouped with their forces, and in consultation with the Great Khan's Stormseers, they would learn that Durin was under the sway from an alien domination which was originating from the warp. This domination was exerted through a series of extra-dimensional portals within the major Mesa-top cities. These Stormseers advised that the closing of these portals was the only way to end the enslavement of Durin. Thus began the campaign to liberate Durin from its Xenos oppressors. Horus appointed Jaghatai Khan as the campaign's commander, a rare occurrence given the often fraught relations amongst Primarchs when it came to the leadership role. Although the decision was sound, Mortarion, who had a renown, deep-seated and almost irrational aversion to the use of psychers, would protest vehemently. As a result, the Death Guard, who served under the Khan's command, only did so nominally, maintaining a significant distance from the other legions. The campaign to free Durin stretched over nearly 6 Terran months, as Jaghatai Khan strategically employed his forces, with the White Scars conducting operations across Durin's harsh terrain. They would face an array of grotesque and barely definable Xenos creatures, characterized by their bloated bodies, which floated on unseen arythic currents, multiple eyes, and lashing tendrils. To this day, some believe that these were manifestations of the Chaos God's power, rather than a Xenos species, as they also had the ability to unleash devastating blasts of warp energy, and it seemed these beings were also supported by throngs of mind slaves under their control. The Stormseers played a rather crucial role in not only locating these abominations, but neutralizing their psychic influences by dampening the effects of the Xenos domination. The Stormseers enabled the White Scars to engage and defeat the Xenos puppet masters. Though the battles did extract a significant toll, the struggle to emancipate Durn was a testament to the White Scars' resilience, their ability to lead, and their adaptability in the face of overwhelming and otherworldly adversaries. The campaign culminated at the epicenter of the warp-born monstrosities, the Mesa Top City, where the three Primarchs first encountered the Xenos Dominators. As the Primarchs would advance deeper into the city, the psionic waves would intensify their assault, as they grew even more formidable than they were before, as if it were a cornered animal striking out with all it had left. While the Xenos abominations they faced became increasingly more monstrous and grotesque. The escalating threat posed by the Xenos psychic onslaught threatened even the formidable Primarchs. Without the White Scars Stormseers who adeptly repelled the worst of the psychic counterattacks, the situation could have escalated disastrously out of control. The very fabric of reality seemed to stretch and groan as the warp's unlight was seeping through countless rifts within the city's fissures, altering the city's very landscape into an abomination of otherworldly shapes and sizes. Buildings and streets' very geometry became Lovecraftian. Above them loomed a horrifying archway, and its substance was a grotesque parody of flesh that once might have been human. Beneath its archway was a void which pulsated with the raw, unfiltered power of the warp, through which emerged a colossal, grotesque entity. This abomination was truly vast, as it had a distended central sac, adorned with writhing pseudopods, and a multitude of malignant, all-seeing eyes. In a moment of grim determination, Jaghatai Khan invoked an ancient Chigoran curse, vowing that this monstrous entity would not be allowed to exist or extend its dominion over the realm of his Gene Father. With his resolve set, Jaghatai Khan and his brothers took their positions flanking the beast, while the remaining Stormseers' council formed a protective ring around them. Each Stormseer would pour their remaining strength into warding off the creature's vile kin. Imperial historians might speculate about the nature of the force capable of challenging not one, but three of the Emperor's Gene Sons. In the ensuing battle, the answer became painfully clear, as the behemoth unleashed an arsenal of devastating weaponry from its razor-sharp tentacles to overwhelm the Primarchs. This confrontation proved catastrophic, as within mere seconds, 10 Stormseers fell, as their minds were shattered by the behemoth's brutal psychic onslaught. The climactic battle against the Xenos Dominators of Durn would continue on, and some of the descriptions would lend many to think this was an early incursion by the Tyranids, as this confrontation would push the Primarchs to their very limits. Although their resilience was legendary, they were not wholly immune to the agonizing trials presented by this unique Xenos behemoth. Even Horus, despite his formidable prowess, was not untouched by the creature's relentless psychic assaults. The immense presence of the beast's mental onslaught caused blood to stem from his eyes in a harrowing display of his suffering. Mortarion faced similar challenges, despite his scythe being able to more easily cleave through the beast's writhing tentacles. The creature would attempt to dominate his mind and control his body, forcing the Lord of Death to his knees. Even though this happened, he managed to resist the onslaught proper, but the mental and physical strain on him was overwhelming. In the end, it was Jaghatai Khan who brought the battle to a close. Thanks to the valiant efforts of his remaining Stormseers, Jaghatai was rendered imperceptible to the behemoth's psychic senses. And while the creature focused its fury on Horus and Mortarion, Jaghatai navigated around the bloated beast's very form, seeking a critical vulnerability. Much speculation regarding the possible consequences had Jaghatai delayed his devastating blow still remains. and many ponder how the outcome may have changed the course of history had the behemoth continued its assault on the Primarchs and even slain Horus and Mortarion, leaving the remaining traitors down two of their heaviest hitters. However, such musings are academic at best, overshadowed by the reality of Jaghatai's actions as he thrust his weapon upwards, piercing a vital organ within the behemoth, causing the beast to succumb to this fatal strike. But the subsequent release of the etheric energy would go on to nearly claim Jaghatai's life. It was Horus who would then intervene, rescuing Jaghatai from being consumed by the collapsing vortex of warp energy. Thus, the emancipation of Durin was achieved. Yet the victory came at a grievous cost, as the destruction of the behemoth and the sealing of the warp portals led to the immediate mental collapse of hundreds of millions of enslaved beings. These mind-controlled individuals had just fallen where they stood, their lives utterly extinguished. In reality, this outcome was merely a grim mercy for the inhabitants of Durin and the Imperium as a whole. Their continued existence under such alien abominations' domination would have been intolerable, and their deaths, though tragic, spared them from an even darker fate of an eternity of servitude. Later would come the Pale Emperor's Chronicle. The tale of the Pale Emperor remains largely shrouded in obscurity, known only to a select few, as it has not been immortalized in the grand epics by remembrancers or captured in vivid Pict recordings. Nonetheless, amongst the White Scars, the story persists, particularly when outsiders question the Great Khan's martial prowess, or the darker edge concealed beneath his smile. While the precise details of this narrative have been lost to embellishment and varied interpretations by the White Scars themselves, the core of this truth endures across all versions of this tale. In the latter years of the Great Crusade, approximately around 980 M30, a force of about 5 brotherhoods ventured into the remote recesses of the Mandragoran sector. The exact brotherhoods involved vary with each retelling, and the White Scars' own record-keeping only adds to the confusion. But one constant remains. The Great Khan, Jaghatai Khan, led this expedition at the very fringes of known space, where darkness obscured the potential Xenos threats. The White Scars encountered several worlds which were sparsely inhabited by people of ancient Terran origin. These worlds, unnamed in White Scars accounts, were marked by small cities that had remarkably thrived at the sector's edge. Unlike many human colonies that had suffered in the dark age of technology, these have persevered and preserved a pure human gene stock, along with possessing technology comparable to that of the Imperium. Despite their limited size, which precluded significant resistance, the Great Khan's overtures for peaceful integration were met with hostility. Rather than being welcomed as kin or liberators, the White Scars were greeted as invaders, and their fleet was swiftly engaged. Jaghatai Khan, a figure as much a diplomat as a warrior, had hoped for peaceful compliance. Nevertheless, he welcomed the opportunity to test his warriors against a worthy adversary. The vessels, now rising from low orbit, confronted the sleek White Scars cruisers. Evidently their skills had been seasoned by centuries of defending against raiders and corsairs. However, their numbers were insignificant when compared to an Imperial armada, and within a few exchanges of fire, they would be left burning and incapacitated. In recognition for their courage, Jaghatai ordered their withdrawal. With orbital space secured, Jaghatai Khan led combat drop pods onto the planet's broader plains, utilizing gunships and landing crafts to deliver his forces quickly and to begin to engage. On the surface, several thousand White Scars would engage the defenders, which were merely several hundred warriors, clad in massive battleplate and equipped with heavy bore cannons and beam arrays, resembling small tanks more than traditional infantry, allowing them to stand against Astartes on a nearly even footing. In a rare display of mutual respect, the two sides gathered outside the city's clustered towers. Their shared desire to avoid undue destruction was clearly evident. The ensuing battle would be marked by the thunderous roar of cannons and a cacophony of clashing blades as each side fiercely contested the field, while actively preserving the integrity of the city and the lives of the innocents therein. The formidable battleplate of the enemy proved resistant to much of the White Scars' lighter weaponry. It seems that they had access to a remnant of lost technologies from the bygone dark age of technology. Yet, these ancient Terran kin could not rival the White Scars' unparalleled speed. While other legions might have engaged directly, the White Scars' vanguard, mounted on skimmer pattern jet bikes, employed the strategy of flanking and harassment in order to win, as they expertly identified and exploited weak points in the enemy's armor joints and power transfer cables, as they maneuvered the battlefield with remarkable agility. In stark contrast, the enemy's advance was rigid in lockstep formation, which led to struggles in maintaining cohesion while their heavy cannons scarred the terrain with immense craters. In contrast, the White Scars' approach was rather chaotic but calculated, with their jet bike mounted forces seemingly erratic patterns being expertly designed to fracture the enemy's formation and cohesion, isolating their forces from mutual support. Following the initial assaults, the White Scars would deploy heavy weapons and armored vehicles to systematically cripple the isolated war machines. As the battle wore on, the enemy's casualties mounted, and significant gaps began to appear in their protective formations. Seizing the opportunity, the White Scars' jetbike squadrons shifted from skirmishing tactics to a concentrated assault, aimed directly at the heart of the enemy's formations. Leading this decisive charge was the Great Khan himself, Jaghatai Khan, as his formidable presence matched the size and power of the enemy's larger war machines, and his blade moved with a speed which greatly outpaced their sensory augurs. Motivated by their Primarch's example, the White Scars intensified their own assault, isolating and decimating enemy war machines one by one. Following their hard-fought victory, the Great Khan himself displayed his customary mercy as he spared the cities of his defeated foes, as a gesture of respect and restraint. From the ranks of the victorious warriors, Jaghatai Khan selected his three most distinguished individuals to act as ambassadors to the Enclave's ruler. These champions, emboldened by the strength and honor of the White Scars, would be entrusted with the Primarch's message: serve the Emperor and thrive, or oppose him and face inevitable ruin. This campaign would epitomize the Great Khan. This campaign was a moment that epitomized the Great Khan's preferred method of warfare, engaging in honorable combat, followed swiftly by a dignified surrender. Unlike some of his brothers who preferred prolonged conflicts and total annihilation and submission, Jaghatai Khan was at his core a builder of empires, seeking to expand the imperium with respect and fairness rather than sheer brutality. In a matter of hours, the Great Khan's emissaries were dispatched with the Pale Emperor, who was to return in a matter of hours. The Great Khan's emissaries dispatched to negotiate with the Pale Emperor were returned to his camp in a state of mutilation. This brutal response from the Pale Emperor's guards was a stark repudiation of the Great Khan's previous gestures of goodwill. Despite the White Scars' evident superiority on the battlefield, this act of defiance, driven by the Pale Emperor's hubris, ignited a fury within Jaghatai Khan, one that his sons had rarely seen. That very night, the White Scars unleashed their weapons upon the unnamed city, reducing it to ashes. The Legion's vengeance was swift and unrelenting, as they burned the shattered city's towers and executed every last inhabitant. Their campaign of destruction continued across the worlds of the Pale Emperor's domain, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake as they advanced towards the Pale Emperor's throne world. Upon reaching the throne world, the White Scars faced the Pale Emperor's finest and most formidable war machines, and in the end, they dismantled these defenses with ruthless efficiency as they breached the gilded gates of the Pale Emperor's palace and slaughtered all within, sparing only one. In the midst of ruin, the Pale Emperor was found cornered upon his throne, and it was an emblem of misplaced pride. Jaghatai Khan, whose armor was stained with the blood of the fallen and the ashes of the destroyed empire, confronted him in this final act of retribution. In a tense and chilling address, Jaghatai Khan spoke to the defeated ruler, saying, "You have chosen this doom. You forced my hand for the sake of your own petty pride. I would like to kill you, to have your blood join that of all the others you have forced me to kill, but I will not. You will remain here, and let the others know the price of pride, that we shall not have to sully our blades again." This version of the tale, recounted by the White Scars, is seen as one of the more revered retellings, as it stands as a great testament to the Legion's strength and a stern warning for those who might underestimate their Primarch or his warriors. Yet, an alternative account exists, shared only by the oldest Jagoran recruits. These veterans recount of a different declaration from Jaghatai Khan, one which reflected a deeper and more personal wound within the Legion and its Primarch. In this altered narrative, Jaghatai Khan's words take a more introspective tone by stating, "You have chosen the doom I could not. You have chosen pride over servitude. I would like to kill you, for you remind me of my own choices, but I will not. You will remain here, so that I will remember the price of pride and why we sully our blades with the slaughter of small empires." This version, while potentially being more close to the truth, casts Jaghatai's actions not just as a record of vengeance, but as a reflection on the nature of pride and the burdens borne by those who wield power. From this point on, the relationship between Primarchs and Legions has a profound effect on each Legion's future. Jaghatai Khan's most profound alliances amongst his fellow brothers were with Horus of the Luna Wolves, Magnus the Red of the Thousand Suns, along with Sanguinius. With Horus, the Great Khan shared a mutual appreciation for rapid and decisive assaults, and he felt a deep sense of understanding and acceptance. Similarly with Magnus the Red, who Jaghatai Khan often felt like a fellow outsider, and Magnus along with Sanguinius would be the two Primarchs who would stand with Jaghatai Khan in his defense of the continued use of the Librarius. This camaraderie extended into their respective legions as well, as the White Scars frequently operated alongside the Luna Wolves, blending the aggressive tactics of the 5th with the more consolidated approach and hierarchical structure of the Luna Wolves. This synthesis of tactics proved rather effective, though some Chagorans found the integration of the two legions into one operating force rather challenging. The Thousand Suns, who were known for their pursuits of knowledge and their cosmic subtleties, also found a valuable ally in the White Scars, sharing a mutual detachment from the broader Imperium. In stark contrast to these, the 5th Legion's relationship with almost all other Space Marine legions was fraught with difficulties, as the White Scars' interactions with the Death Guard and their Primarch Mortarion were noted to be particularly strained. Similar tensions extended to the Space Wolves Legion, whose reputation as the Emperor's executioners often overshadowed their interactions with the White Scars. The White Scars, who were marked by ritual tribal scars, were frequently misjudged as savages. This was a perception that deepened their sense of estrangement with the other legions. The White Scars also shared a rather notable sense of resentment for these misconceptions, yet they would remain steadfast in their identity and values. Unlike the executioners of the Space Wolves, the Berserkers of the World Eaters, or the supposedly perfect Astartes of the Emperor's Children, the White Scars prided themselves on their speed and their efficiency. Their refusal to conform to others' expectations only further fueled the misunderstanding and disregard from their peers. Rivalries amongst Space Marine chapters, especially those with roots in the first foundings, would become inevitable as time would go on. Such conflicts would become both symbolic and physical, and have persisted across millennia, far past the days of the legions. The animosity between the Space Wolves and the Dark Angels is a well-documented one. Yet many other rivalries exist. One such notable example is the long-lasting tensions between the White Scars and the Raven Guard. Their mutual mistrust has endured for centuries, and it all comes from specific conflicts in the ancient past, such as the assault on Hive Lin Mei and the last march on the Sapphire Worlds. These conflicts and others have only intensified the discord between the bloodlines. The most acrimonious incident between these two was Operation Kronos, where the venerated Raven Guard chaplain would succumb to an enslaver's domination despite the proximity of a White Scars force that might have intervened. Such events have fostered a long-lasting enmity between both chapters, leaving them with a barely contained loathing that persists late into the 41st millennium. During the Great Crusade, the White Scars Legion, commanded by Jaghatai Khan from his flagship, the Swordstorm, emerged as a formidable force on the battlefield. Their approach to warfare was like a bolt of lightning in clear skies. Much like a sudden and devastating storm, they struck with unrelenting fury. Their tactics, often characterized by swift actions and an unbridled passion for combat, were tempered by a profound, if often hidden, strategic wisdom that few took time to appreciate. This would be especially useful during the Ulnar Crusade. The White Scars, who excelled in the chaos of combat, adeptly navigating its unpredictability and exploiting their enemies' vulnerabilities, would act as the vanguard of the Great Crusade almost at all times. A relentless force that cleared the path for the Imperium's advancing armies, weakening enemies well before the main force would engage proper. Their contributions were critical for the many victories of the Great Crusade, victories that would have been elusive without their relentless efforts. The same mobile warfare tactics and techniques that Jaghatai Khan employed on the steppes of Chagoris would prove invaluable on the battlefields, such as those of the Ulnar Crusade, which was the most notable engagement at the end of the Great Crusade, as a colossal imperial assault would be undertaken on the Orc Empire ruled by Overlord Uruk. Within this epic campaign, the White Scars became one of the linchpins for the Imperium's victory, as they fought alongside the Ultramarines, who were also supported by an Imperial army, by the large majority of the Imperial army, the Mechanicum, along with the Collegia Titanica. This monumental campaign targeted the single largest and strongest concentration of orcs ever encountered by the Imperium of Man, one that would put even the current Prophet of the Wa, Gazgul Mag Uruk-Draka's own armies to shame. Following the resounding success of the Ulnar Crusade, Jaghatai Khan observed with approval as Horus Lupercal, the most favored son of the Emperor and the greatest of the Primarchs, in the eyes of many, would assume his new role as the War Master and the leader of all Imperial military forces. The Khan and Horus shared a rather notable mutual respect and camaraderie with each other, and at this ascension, the Khan was rather happy and proud of his brother. With the conclusion of the triumph of Ulnar, a grand assembly of Primarchs, commanders, battleships, and officials would be dispersed, all setting course for a myriad of destinations, and igniting the warp with the brilliance of their departure. The Great Crusade would continue, now led by the War Master rather than the Emperor himself, marking a new chapter in the Imperium's relentless expansion. The Council of Nicaea would be the next major event which involved the White Scars directly, and had a long-lasting impact. As the White Scars prepared for the next campaign in the Great Crusade, a pivotal imperial assembly would be conveyed on the world of Nicaea. This monumentous event would be recorded in the history books as the Council of Nicaea, which was summoned by the Emperor of Mankind himself. Its purpose was to deliberate on the implications of the usage of psychic powers, as in whether they were beneficial as an asset or a perilous threat to humanity as a whole, and the Imperium itself. The debate over the use of psychic abilities was primarily shaped by three prominent Primarchs, who had significantly influenced the development of the Legion Astartes Librarius. Two of these figures are rather well documented in historical records, as being Magnus of the Thousand Suns, the most vocal advocate for the use of psychic powers, and the angelic Sanguinius of the Blood Angels, whose support was more understated yet equally influential. In contrast, Jaghatai Khan's contributions to the discourse on psychic abilities remains less acknowledged, but in no way less important. Despite having formulated many rules and structures for the Librarius, Jaghatai's pivotal role in the development of psychic powers and the practices of therein within the Space Marine Legions would never be officially documented or recognized proper. His insights and the influence he had on the psychic arts were only known to a select few, in particular his brother Primarchs. At this time, the broader Imperium was steeped in the belief of the imperial truth, a doctrine that asserted that humanity had transcended superstition and religious belief. Citizens were taught that what seemed like magic was merely a result of the burgeoning capabilities of the human mind. However, Chagoris and its populace, including the White Scars, maintained a rather different perspective. They understood the dangers of the warp and its potential for corruption. These insights had shaped their cautious approach to the use of psychic powers. On Chagoris, the use of psychic abilities was referred to as the test of heaven. The Chagorans had long been aware of the warp's existence and the perilous entities within it, a knowledge that had empowered their Stormseers in a similar manner to the Space Wolves of Fenris, who employed their own psychic power, despite what they may say, through the use of rune priests, although they would seldom acknowledge that these powers were derived from the warp, in a rather hypocritical manner that cost the Imperium greatly. The general population of the Imperium would remain largely ignorant of the warp and what it actually was, with only a select few being aware of its true nature. Thus, while the Council of Nicaea was a crucial juncture in the history of the use of psychic powers, the complex relationship between the Imperium and the Imperium's doctrines, along with the ancient traditions of the Chagorans, would be left largely unexamined by imperial scholars. The Emperor of Mankind, throughout his long rule, had chosen to shroud certain truths from the populace, actively suppressing any who thought they should seek out and reveal these truths. This approach was a source of considerable contention between him and his son Jaghatai Khan, the Khan who held the most transparent view of the universe. Frequently clashed with the Emperor over the latter's reluctance to educate humanity about the true nature of chaos. Their disagreement was centered on the fundamental question of, can a vast empire be sustained on a foundation of falsehoods? The warp, contrary to popular misconception perpetuated by the Imperium, was not a being or a simple entity. It was a living, dangerous force, capable of both corrupting and or unifying humanity. The Imperium, in its willful, intentional ignorance, chose to remain blind to the true nature of the warp, a decision that would eventually contribute greatly to its precarious stability. Initially, Magnus the Red had opposed the integration of the Librarius into the legions, as he envisioned a future where every psyker could explore their full potential without the restrictions or oversights that would come of it. However, his vision was countered by many of his brothers, including Jaghatai Khan and Sanguinius, who both argued that such unchecked power could be perilous and required stringent regulation. Consequently, they established a rigid framework to govern the use of psychic abilities, a measure designed to mitigate the inherent risks therein. In Chagoris, the practice of wielding psychic powers, referred to as walking the path of heaven, which was included in their Stormseers training, was understood as a necessary thing to be educated about to mitigate the dangers of the warp. They taught their psychers, known as Zagadan Arga, that deviation from this path could lead to the erosion of their very souls by the warp's corrupting influence. As the debates over psychic powers would reach their climax within the Imperium, the future of the Space Marine legions would now hang in the balance as the Council deliberated. Some viewed the librarians as dangerous witches deserving of eradication. Others saw them as nascent deities, and ultimately, the witch hunters would emerge victorious in this overall ideological struggle, shaping the future practices of the Imperium. During the pivotal Council of Nicaea, the debate over the use of psychic powers and the fate of the Librarius proper would culminate when Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, vocally championed the use of psykers and psychic sorcery, advocating for their potential to enhance the Imperium's capabilities. However, Magnus's fervent defense of psychic powers, coupled with his unrestrained rhetoric, only fueled the fears of his opponents. In large part, these were Mortarion and the hypocritical Leman Russ. His failure to temper his argument and acknowledge the need for reform within the legions contributed significantly to the council's outcome. In stark contrast, Stormseer Jaghatai Yasugi, a junior librarian within the White Scars, presented a compelling alternative. Yasugi proposed a third path, rendering the use of psychic abilities and the future of the Librarius. Regarding the use of psychic abilities and the future of the Librarius, he argued that psykers, if properly trained and disciplined, could be valuable assets rather than threats. His proposal emphasized that, like any weapon, psychic powers required careful handling and respect. The Stormseer's vision would include a rigorous training regime to harness the psykers' innate abilities more effectively, ensuring their loyalty to the Emperor while mitigating the risks associated with the warp. He also advocated for the strict prohibition on psychic sorcery, recognizing the inherent dangers of actively engaging with entities within the warp, originating from within the warp. Despite these reasoned arguments, the Emperor's judgment at the council was notably harsh. His declaration, heavily influenced by the long-standing frustration, would be heavily influenced by his long-standing frustration with Magnus's own personal disobedience regarding forbidden sorceries, which had been a point of contention between the two for years on end, led the Emperor to decree that within the sole exception of navigators and astropaths, who had been rigorously trained and bred to be controlled and in essence were indispensable for the Imperium's continued functioning, the Space Marine legions were to disband their Librarius departments. All Space Marine librarians were ordered to actively and permanently cease the use of their psychic abilities, marking a significant shift in the Imperium's approach to the use of psychic powers, sealing the fate of the Librarius and the legions therein. In the wake of the Council of Nicaea, a significant shift occurred within the Space Marine legions. The Council's decision to curtail the use of psychic powers led to the establishment of a new role, the Space Marine Chaplain. This position was created to uphold the Imperial truth, despite the ironic naming, and to ensure the purity of each legion's adherence to the Emperor's command. Chaplains were tasked with safeguarding the spiritual and doctrinal integrity of the Astartes, reinforcing their loyalty and dedication to the Emperor. Jaghatai Khan, reflecting on these proceedings, came to regret the fact that he was not actively present at Nicaea, as he believed that his presence could have influenced the outcome. Positioned alongside his brother, the Angel, and Magnus, he could have offered a warrior primarch's perspective on the Librarius. His absence, due to an assignment on the Chondax system, was a missed opportunity. The Khan had been dispatched just as the council was convened, and though he had the option to defy the War Master's orders, he chose not to, out of respect to Horus. His mission on Chondax tasked him with quelling the remaining Greenskins' threat from the shattered Orc Empire of Uruk which was expected to be a swift and timely ordeal. The Khan and his White Scars Legion were poised for action against the remnants of the warlord's hordes. This type of ongoing warfare was characterized by cavalry charges and a relentless pursuit, a familiar and appealing style of warfare to Jaghatai Khan, who relished in the opportunity to hunt Xenos across the open terrains of the galaxy. The White Scars embraced this campaign with fervor. The White Scars would embrace this campaign with a rather virtuous fervor. Their starships, adorned with the symbols of their legion, surged through the void, brimming with eager warriors, as the legion's commitment to hunt was seen by all as unwavering, driven by their instinct and understanding of combat. Jaghatai chose to follow through with the campaign as a whole, despite the pivotal moment at Nicaea occurring in the manner that he would later regret. This exemplified his dedication to his duties, and his legion's martial ethos. During the cataclysmic events of the Horus Heresy, the White Scars legend expanded dramatically. For over 7 Terran years, the 5th Legion engaged in ruthless combat across hundreds of worlds, battling the traitor legions and the myriad of chaos forces which would continue to spring about. Through this tumultuous period, Jaghatai Khan remained steadfast in his loyalty to the Emperor. Unlike several of his brothers, in particular those who were close to him, he never entertained the notion of allying with the ruinous powers. For Jaghatai, such treachery was inconceivable. The Emperor had wronged none of his sons directly or intentionally, and Jaghatai was unwavering in his commitment to the Emperor's overall vision of unifying humanity under a singular sovereign rule. Prior to the outbreak of the Horus Heresy, the White Scars had been deeply entrenched in their grueling campaigns against the Orcs in the Chondax system, a mission commanded by War Master Horus, seemingly to keep Jaghatai and his legion out from the battle proper for as long as possible. It was from this harsh battleground that Jaghatai withdrew his entire legion upon the onset of the heresy. The news reached them at the Chondax system, and reports claimed that Leman Russ had turned against the Imperium, driven by his own enmity towards Magnus of the Thousand Suns. According to accounts, Russ had led his Space Wolves to annihilate the Thousand Suns, killing Magnus in a brutal confrontation. However, the Ruin Storm, a catastrophic warp storm unleashed by the Wordbearers during the Battle of Calth, had rendered further astropathic communication erratic and unreliable. The White Scars' own fleet of astropaths would therein struggle to decipher the flood of contradictory messages, compounding the confusion. As the Chondax campaign had drawn to a close, it seems that the first ominous signs of trouble within the Imperium would surface, in particular the early and vague reports which hinted at a significant upheaval. However, these were often dismissed as distortions of the Imperium. Nonetheless, the unsettling messages weighed heavily on Jaghatai, eroding his rest and intensifying his sense of an impending crisis. This would all get compounded as conflicting communications from Rogel Dorn of the Imperial Fists exacerbated the situation. Dorn's message urged the White Scars to return to Terra post-haste to fortify the throne world alongside Rogel Dorn and Leman Russ, now allegedly a traitor in the eyes of many. This ambiguity and urgency of orders led only to the heightened anxiety of the Khan's own person, especially since the Imperium now teetered on the brink of cataclysm. The unfolding chaos of the Horus Heresy struck with an intensity that confounded even the most seasoned and brilliant of strategists. The once clear lines of allegiance became obscured by a maelstrom of contradictory astropathic reports and secure comm bursts. Reports flooded in, many reports like the ones involving Leman Russ and the Space Wolves going rogue flooded in. Or was it the were the ones involving the War Master himself, allegedly taking out several legions and betraying the Emperor, to be believed? The White Scars were summoned. During this cacophony of chaos, the White Scars were also summoned to reinforce the Alpha Legion on the Axilius Nebula. Ferrus Manus, and information that Ferrus Manus had been purportedly slain by Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children would reach them, almost at the same time that information that Mars and the Mechanicum had revolted against the Emperor. The origins of these messages varied widely. Some bore chronomarks from many months past. Others seem to have been dispatched only hours earlier. Amidst this whirlwind, the War Master Horus commanded the White Scars to enact retribution upon the Space Wolves, yet Jaghatai Khan, ever the strategist, refrained from launching an attack on Leman Russ and his warriors without further clarification. In this, the 5th Legion would stand poised and ready, but their Primarch would be confronted by a fog of uncertainty, rendering his true enemies and the shifting loyalties of the Imperium beyond his reach. Then came a communication from Leman Russ himself, recently returned from the devastating Battle of Prospero, where the Space Wolves had clashed with their erstwhile rivals, the Thousand Suns. The 6th Legion's fleet, having regrouped at the Axilius Nebula, found itself besieged by the Alpha Legion. Horus had unleashed the 20th to launch a formidable assault on the already battered and beaten Space Wolves. The Alpha Legion, led by the twin Primarchs, Alpharius and Omegon, it seems had long harbored some amount of animosity towards the Space Wolves, and particularly their Primarch, Leman Russ. The Space Wolves' scorn for the Alpha Legion's reliance on subterfuge over direct combat was rather well known, oftentimes belittling the Legion and their Primarchs as a whole. The Alpha Legion sought to exploit this discord that currently confounded the Space Wolves. Their aim was not only to confront Russ, but to delay him and prevent his contribution to the defense of Terra. Despite the sympathy for the Space Wolves' plight, Jaghatai Khan opted for caution. The conflicting and contradictory astropathic messages had left him in a state of profound uncertainty, until he could unequivocally determine who his true allies and his true adversaries were. Along with ascertaining who had genuinely betrayed the Emperor, he would not commit to any side. With this decision, the Khan resolved to seek clarity elsewhere. While the White Scars prepared to depart the Chondak system proper, a formidable flotilla of Alpha Legionnaires would encounter them. This encounter was particularly disconcerting as the Alpha Legion remained an enigma to the White Scars as a whole, and they were unresponsive to communications, maintaining a deliberate distance as they amassed an imposing array of warships in a rather threatening manner. The strategic landscape was in turmoil, with the White Scars facing off in a rather uncertain standoff with the Alpha Legion. Despite their numerous attempts to establish communications with the 20th Legion, their command remained unresponsive. Under the orders of Jaghatai Khan, the White Scars vessels were instructed to avoid escalating the situation. They were to refrain from engaging the Alpha Legion unless directly provoked, maintaining a strict perimeter to prevent the Alpha Legions from breaching the White Scars fleet's own defensive core. As the Khan pondered his next move, the Alpha Legion's blockade persisted with a particular precision. The Alpha Legion's warships mirrored every move the White Scars would do in such perfect synchronicity that it was actively uncanny even to the Primarch. While the Alpha Legion had yet to yield or pose a direct threat, their actions betrayed a clear intent, though what that intent was remained elusive. The situation would grow increasingly complex as the White Scars' astropathic choir intercepted official communications from Terra, delivered directly by Rogel Dorn. The message was unequivocal. The White Scars were to make an immediate post-haste beeline to the throne world for further instructions and clarification. This directive was starkly clear in its origins and its intent. The 5th Legion was commanded to disregard all claims of loyalty, particularly those of War Master Horus, who had been declared a traitor along with any legions that sided with him. Yet Jaghatai Khan remained unmoved by these demands. He grappled with the resurgence of old resentments, the frustrations of being overlooked, and the burden of bending to the imperial decrees to avoid being dominated. The White Scars' frequent isolation from the broader imperial affairs had left a bitter taste, which led to a rather bitter realization. Their status as the last to receive crucial information had a rather steep cost. Now the Khan perceived the broader strategic game at play. The Alpha Legion's apparent reluctance to engage was not a gesture of friendship, but a deliberate tactic to sow confusion. By keeping the White Scars tethered to Chondax, the Alpha Legion aimed to disrupt their strategic focus and delay their response. The manipulative nature of the Alpha Legion was evident in these actions, as they sought to ensure the White Scars received Rogaldorn's urgent call for aid. By stalling their departure, the Alpha Legion guaranteed that the White Scars would be aware of Terra's plea for support. However, the Khan refused to be swayed by these directives from any source, including the Throne World, which had only recently begun to acknowledge the White Scars' role in the greater galactic conflict. The White Scars were resolute in their independence. They were warriors of Jaghatai Khan, bound by no one but themselves, and were now determined to uncover the truth behind the tumultuous messages and conflicting reports. The Khan and his legion would seek answers on their own terms. Only when they had ascertained the full scope of the betrayal and the true nature of the threats facing the Imperium would they act. The White Scars, ever ready to confront Xenos' adversaries, embarked on a decisive maneuver. Jaghatai Khan would issue direct orders for his fleet to prepare for an immediate departure from the Chondax system. Across the vast expanse of the galactic battlefield, the White Scars' escort craft were to execute synchronized movements, creating a protective screen against the encircling Alpha Legion forces. Their interfleet communications were severed actively, and incoming communications were blocked. The Alpha Legion had their opportunity to diplomatically engage, and their communications would now be disregarded going forward. The White Scars deployed their standard tactical maneuver known as the Zao, or the Chessel in Low Gothic. This maneuver, executed on a unified command of the 5th Legion's flagship, the Swordstorm, involved a full fleet formation designed to maximize the operational efficiency and speed of each vessel in tandem, with each starship in the Imperium's arsenal, as each starship in the Imperium's arsenal was a unique creation, with its reactors' secrets guarded closely by the tech priests of Mars, and shared only within the privileged circles of the Mechanicum. It seems the Primarchs were the only ones able to execute a significant influence over their vessels' design and construction. Korax favored stealth. Vulcan prioritized durability. Fulgrim sought beauty and perfection. Similarly, each Primarch's preferences shaped their legion's fleet, as it reflected in the countless and nigh endless refits and modifications done to each ship within their legion. The case of the White Scars, their fleet was designed for a singular enhancement, unparalleled and unrivaled speed within the Imperium's vessels. The 5th Legion's Tech Marines dedicated solar decades to enhancing their reactor power fields and refining the maneuverability beyond the standard tolerances of even the Emperor's own ship. This relentless pursuit of velocity came with certain trade-offs. Gunnery captains frequently lamented the reduction in lance range, as it was well known that the White Scars warships carried fewer troops and dropships overall compared to their counterparts and even the standard vessels of the Imperium. However, these sacrifices were accepted as part of the Legion's dedication to the swift and wild riding traditions of their Chagoran plains. Under the Khan's strict orders, the Legion's advanced drive capabilities were not showcased outside of active combat zones. As a result, their specialized fleet and the modifications done to them were largely unknown to other legions, save for a few speculative reports describing elongated engine housings and intricate thruster formations, along with oversized fuel lines. This speculation contributed to a formidable fleet being sent against them, in order to attempt to contend with the fact that even the largest of their warships and the most agile system runners shared a reputation for exceptional speed and being unmatched in said aspect. With that knowledge, the White Scars fleet initiating their departure rather than engaging with the Alpha Legion became the obvious choice. However, the Alpha Legion's blockade remained steadfast, meticulously guarding against any escape routes to the nearest Mandeville jump points, effectively containing the White Scars within the Chondak system. Each vessel of the Alpha Legion's own fleet mirrored the movements of the White Scars, despite the difference in speed, maintaining a vast and relatively sound net of ships across the void. The gap between the two fleets would gradually narrow as the Alpha Legion's formation adhered to their classic blockade strategy, creating a rigid web across the expanse with the intent of trapping the White Scars. This formation was fortified by secondary ranks of warships held in reserve, ensuring that any breach would be met with an immediate reinforcement. The Alpha Legion's every movement was cautious, aimed at holding this stalemate as long as humanly possible. When the two vanguards closed within lance range, the White Scars detected incoming Vox requests from the Alpha Legion, but chose to ignore them, having offered the enemy ample opportunity to communicate diplomatically prior to this. Without further warning, the Alpha Legion opened fire on their erstwhile brothers. The White Scars ships would quickly begin to probe the line, while the Alpha Legion's vessels would counter each attempt at the White Scars in breaking said line by maintaining their classic containment pattern. This strategy was designed specifically to trap the 5th Legion within a confined area and prevent any of their individual warships from escaping the cordon. The standard response to such a containment would be a full-scale assault on the blockade, aiming to drive back the encircling forces through concentrated ship-to-ship fire. This approach, however, carried a significant risk and would have been disastrous for both sides, a risk typically embodied only by the more reckless Primarchs such as Leman Russ or Angron. The Alpha Legion seemed to have correctly assessed that Jaghatai Khan was not inclined towards such reckless or barbaric measures. Instead, the White Scars vanguard began a calculated drift spinwards, deviating from their jump point trajectory and drawing the core of the engagement back towards Chondak's gravity well. This maneuver appeared almost casual, as though the commanders were executing a tentative breakout without full commitment. As the intensity of last fire increased, the drift became more pronounced. Despite the rising conflict, individual engagements from the White Scars remained restrained. No torpedoes were launched and no gunship wings were deployed. The clash between fleets took on a particular character. Mirror warships from both sides engaged in a limited probing skirmish, reflecting a half-hearted embrace of controlled aggression. Through the engagement zone, the White Scars' positions began to deteriorate under the relentless, methodical pressure from the Alpha Legion. The 5th Legion's vessels, once in cohesive formation, started to falter as their ranks disintegrated as they deviated to protect their flanks. The once unyielding offensive wall now revealed gaps, mirroring the disruption of a strong headwind sweeping across the Altic plains of Chagoris. The vanguard's momentum seemed to wane at this point, and the White Scars appeared to be on the brink of collapse. Then, in a dramatic shift, the chronograph struck 0, and at that very moment, all the White Scars vessels surged into full attack speed simultaneously. What had been a disjointed drift pattern transformed instantaneously into a precise and orchestrated arrowhead assault. The fleet's formation, initially languishing in semi-committed positions, coalesced into a singular, unified attack vector with a remarkable efficiency, and the Alpha Legion, likely unaccustomed to such a display of naval mastery, found themselves facing an unprecedented maneuver. Such a feat would have typically required the best Imperial naval officers 5 solar minutes to execute, complete with numerous course corrections and warnings along with extensive preparation. Yet the White Scars accomplished this transition flawlessly, without external direction, in a mere 5 seconds. The fleet's deployment catalyzed into a sharp spearhead, with each of the vessel's movements functioning in flawless synchronization. The White Scars' escorts burst forth, forming a cohesive mass that tore through the Alpha Legion's cordon. Their sudden acceleration and concentrated lance strikes caught the enemy utterly off guard, resulting in the immediate annihilation of 3 bronze-powered destroyers. These ships would be engulfed in a chaotic maelstrom of plasma bursts and torpedo explosions. As the wreckage of their initial assault settled, more White Scars destroyers surged through the debris with audacious precision, as these vessels would corkscrew and dive with the agility of predatory birds, converging in a singular focal point. Here, the White Scars, having abandoned their flanks to the enemy, concentrated their remaining assets in a high-velocity surge, illustrating their unyielding commitment to this singular, decisive breakout. As the battle intensified, the Alpha Legion's encirclement was visibly faltering. The once precise blockade now struggled to contain the White Scars' relentless advance. The imposing capital ships of the Alpha Legions lagged greatly behind, as they were unable to match the speed or the agility, and they were not even able to consider matching the mobility of the White Scars vessels, whose crew had demonstrated near superhuman skills at piloting said vessels. At the forefront of this offensive was the Sword Storm, its colossal plasma engines roaring as it carved through the heart of the Alpha Legion's defenses. This vessel was flanked by a swarm of agile escorts. Efforts by the Alpha Legion's second rank to impede the Storm Sword proved, in essence, useless. Their vessels, now clumsy, slow, and inefficient by comparison in their defensive maneuvers, appeared to lag significantly. Despite their attempts to form a defensive line, their actions seemed sluggish and uncoordinated in comparison to the White Scars' blistering speed and precision. Round the Sword Storm, the White Scars' warship unleashed a relentless barrage of las beams, plasma bolts, and torpedo salvos, creating a massive column of destructive fire. The Chesil Formation, a masterful spearhead of White Scars' strategy, had pierced through the Alpha Legion's cauldron at its most vulnerable point. The formation was slender and agile, like a javelin, raced into open space, leaving nothing but chaos in its wake. The Alpha Legions would struggle to regroup therefrom, pulling their warships back into some semblance of order, akin to an octopus retracting their tentacles. Though the Alpha Legion had not sustained catastrophic losses, the White Scars' decisive assault had shattered their meticulously crafted formations, and the sudden breach had dismantled any shred of cohesion within the Alpha Legion, which they had so carefully assembled. Unburdened by the need to maintain a continuous barrage, the White Scars advanced and accelerated. As the orbit of Chondax receded, the remnants of the Alpha Legion's fleet, dozens of burned-out warships, would illuminate the void, leaving the White Scars vessels now clear of an imminent threat. As they reached their Mandeville points and executed a swift transition into warp space, their next destination remaining shrouded in obscurity. The White Scars were now acutely aware of the formidable obstacles they faced, as they recognized that the warp storms encircling the Chondax system were not of natural origin. Such storms were conjured by an immense force or an ancient arcane device, and required a staggering, ungodly amount of power to do at such a scale. Driven by urgency to uncover the source of this cosmic upheaval, Kagan Jaghatai Khan directed his legion towards the heart of this disturbance, hoping to find and confront the orchestrator behind this chaos. For insight into the warp's true nature, the Khan turned to Magnus the Red, one of the two Primarchs he had ever implicitly trusted. The fate of the Imperium hinged on Magnus' survival. If Magnus lived, there would be hope in the views of Jaghatai. If he had fallen, the future was bleak. With this grim determination, the White Scars set course to Prospero. As the Sword Storm emerged from warp transition in the outer fringes of the Prospero system, its systems activated and initiated auger sweeps across all known space available to them. The results were troubling. No Vox signals were detected, nor were any visible transports or energy trails of said transports visible to them. A system as significant as Prospero should have always been teeming with residual traces of ship activity. Instead, the approach routes from the Mandeville warp point were eerily barren. The Thousand Suns homeworld would come into view, and the initial picked fields were rather bleak. the once lustrous Prospero, known for its serene, idyllic hues and crystalline ice caps, now appeared as a charred and scarred planet, thick with dark clouds covering the skies, and a ravaged surface led to it being reminiscent of the grim atmospheres over Ulnor. As the White Scars fleet entered orbit, Jaghatai Khan ordered a blockade and the preparations for planetfall. Any detection of Fenrisian markers would prompt immediate extermination. When the sword storm reached geosynchronicity above the capital city of Tysa, the evidence of the devastation the planet had undergone was undeniable. Atmospheric readings confirmed severe tectonic disturbances and pollution levels exceeding mortal tolerances, along with signs of heavy bombardments, likely from mass drivers, followed by secondary impacts. The presence of lethal toxins and extensive volcanism further attested to the planet's catastrophic state. An immediate erratic field in the upper atmosphere obscured the White Scars' attempt to deploy landers or drop pods. This world was now dying, and the phenomenon was evidently worsening at a drastic degree. Despite the dangers, Jaghatai Khan resolved to teleport to the surface. It was clear that topographic interference could hinder the extraction of the Primarch and potentially disrupt Vox communication, but he would still undergo this transition. Accompanied by 12 of his Terminator-armed bodyguard, the Keshig, Jaghatai Khan teleported to the unstable surface of Prospero. As they navigated the ruins of the capital city, they were met with an overwhelming sense of destruction. The air was thick with the stench of burning metal, and the remnants of the once great city's libraries and repositories lay in smoldering ruins. If the Space Wolves were indeed responsible, their claims of power were now grimly violated. Determined to find his answers, the Khan directed his warriors to search the subterranean caves he knew were hidden beneath the city. It was there, amidst the remnants of Prospero, where they began their quest for the elusive Crimson King. Amidst the turmoil of the White Scars campaign, an insidious threat emerged from within their own ranks. Some members of the Khan's own command had been affiliated with the warrior lodges, secretive fraternities that operated outside the structure of the Space Marine legions. Despite the Emperor's stern disapproval for these lodges, deeming them dangerously akin to ancient superstitious cults, they proliferated throughout the legions, including the White Scars. The 5th Legion, both Terran and Chigoran warriors, had become involved in these clandestine organizations, as they viewed the Kagan's indecision regarding their stance in the escalating conflict amongst the legions of Astartes as a sign of weakness. Unlike the rest of their brethren, the lodges had already made their allegiance clear. Now the moment had arrived for them to act decisively. Under the leadership of influential Hasek Nayon Khan, the lodge members revealed their allegiances to Horus. They had apparently maintained covert communications with Horus's supporters, utilizing arcane methods since the campaigns at Chondax. With the Kagan away on Prospero's surface, Nayonan Khan had assumed command over the flagship, and by extension, the White Scars fleet as a whole. As Nayan and his co-conspirators positioned themselves for a coup, the movement of personnel between warships intensified. Siban Khan, the commander of the Brotherhood of the Storm, uncovered the subversive activities of Nayan and his faction. As he urgently sought to inform Juman Nayan Khan, who was responsible for the Urdu of the treachery he asked Noyan Khan was undertaking. However, Julman was either unwilling or unable to act on Siban's revelation, dismissing the concerns with little consideration. He ordered Siban to return to his ship, and until further notice, he would not act. This response was not unexpected, as Julman lacked a close relationship with the Primarch and his influence overall. Determined not to let this treachery go unchecked, Siban Khan took decisive action. Back on board the Kajan, he mobilized his brotherhood and prepared for a confrontation. They would take the initiative to counteract this insidious plan and prevent the coup from engulfing their entire legion. Back on Prospero, the devastation of Magnus's once illustrious city was starkly apparent. The Khan wandered through the layers of gray-silver dust, surveying the ruins beneath the stormy skies, as lightning crackled incessantly on the distant northern horizon, casting intermittent glows across the charred remnants of the once majestic structures. Accompanied by his Terminator-equipped Gesheg, Jaghatai's advance was cautious. Their bone-white armor, stark against the darkened landscape, lent them an almost spectral appearance. The full extent of the destruction had been hard for him to accept, particularly given his complex feelings towards Leman Russ. Respect mingled with frustration over his excessive boasts and his self-proclaimed superiority. Yet witnessing the ravaged city firsthand confirmed the grim reality foretold by the White Scars Astartes. As Jaghatai and his warriors ventured deeper into the desolate ruins, they approached the sites of the ancient cult temples within. Amidst the ruins, a strange buzzing noise caught their attention, a sound reminiscent of a distant swarm of insects. Despite no signs of life appearing on their sensors, the unsettling noise persisted. The Khan quickly ordered his warriors to disable their audio sensors and rely only on their sight. As they blinked away the targeting reticles and environmental compensators from their helmet displays, a chilling sight emerged. A spectral blue-white figure. Massive winged forms began to coalesce from the ground. These Silurians were abominable warp creatures drawn to the mental emissions of vulnerable nascent psychers. Historically, these creatures had plagued Prospero, preying upon the unprotected minds. The Thousand Suns had once driven them into the wilderness, away from the city's gleaming spires. Now reduced to spectral remains, these creatures had retained a fragment of their former predatory instincts. The White Scars discovered that their physical weapons were in essence ineffectual against these spectral insects. Blades passed harmlessly through them and their insubstantial forms. However, the creatures' blindness was their only vulnerability, as they were sightless, yet they could sense their prey and struck with their elongated proboscises, penetrating the Terminator's ceramite with ease. As the air filled with the howls of agony, as the creature's proboscises siphoned away vital fluid from the Terminators, who were unable to combat the supernatural menace, Jaghatai ordered a tactical withdrawal. In the midst of their retreat, the ground beneath him collapsed, which was apparently damaged by the Space Wolves' relentless bombardment. The Khan fell into the depths, entombed in debris up to his chest, struggling to establish a connection with his Terminator bodyguard. He was met with only static. Freeing himself from the rubble, Jaghatai found himself in an alien underground realm of sinkholes and chasms, which hinted at the possibility of something more expansive beneath the ruined city. He sought caves, and now he found them. They promised dangers as profound as the ones he had already encountered on the surface. Master Quinza of the Kagesh issued a tactical withdrawal now that their Primarch had been swallowed up by the fissure. However, driven by a mixture of duty and desperation, they would struggle through the treacherous terrain in an attempt to reach the fissure that had swallowed up their Primarch. Their efforts, however, would be in vain. The Kagash would be forced to regroup and fall back to a bombed-out terrace, as they were still pursued by the psychic insects, forcing them to create a defensive line in order to take a stand. Suddenly, a surge of immense power would envelop the chamber they were within, as flames erupted beneath, consuming the creatures in a tempest of purple-tinted fire. The relentless blast caused the entities to disintegrate fully. Amidst the chaos, Quinza sensed a new source of power behind him, as his limbs stiffened under an invisible force, and an intense weight was compressed upon his chest, impeding his movements, as a bolter would be pressed against his armor, pressed flush against his armor. Before him stood a figure clad in crimson, its gold-crested Mark III power armor adorned with the Thousand Suns iconography. The figure would go on to identify itself as Rayvel Arvida, Sergeant of the Thousand Suns' 4th Fellowship, and a member of the Corvade cult. Avila, the sole survivor of his squad, led the Kashing away from the lingering threat of the warp-spawned insects. The Thousand Sun guided the survivors through the desolate cityscapes until they reached the ruins of the Grand Audience Chamber. The White Scars would inquire about his presence on Prospero and the duration of his stay. Arvida explained that he had arrived after the planet's devastation and had no knowledge of the prior events. His power armor's chronometer had also been damaged in battle, leaving him uncertain of how long he had been on the planet. The Thousandth Son acknowledged the White Scars' quest to locate their missing Primarch, emphasizing that their efforts might be in vain. He had believed that their Genestealer was uniquely equipped to combat the warp-born insects, and advised them to leave Prospero. Despite his own state of despair, he agreed to assist the White Scars. However, he requested a brief period to recover his strength. His psychic abilities were indeed crucial for their survival in the trials ahead. Navigating through the newly uncovered tunnels of Prospero, Jaghatai Khan faced the grim reality of his situation. Despite his repeated attempts, he had been unable to find a route back to the surface, as the eerie silence, now punctuated only by the sound of his own footsteps. It seems that the psychic insects had not followed him into the depths, but their absence only added to the foreboding atmosphere. Eventually, the Khan emerged into a vast chamber. The enormity of the space was rather overwhelming, and the upper reaches would be swallowed up by the shadows. The walls, steeply terraced like an ancient amphitheater, were etched with bands of metallic ore. Scattered around the chamber were also broken brass instruments, their forms twisted and shattered. Beneath layers of ash and metal lay the bodies of mortals, evidence of the devastation that had befallen Prospero. The realization struck the Khan. With a harsh clarity, his presence here and the descent to the surface had been a grave mistake. He surveyed the desolation when a subtle movement in the dust caught his attention. A ghastly figure began to materialize, its form glowing with a cold spectral light. The figure stood significantly taller than the Khan, and had a visage both familiar and wary. The single eye of the apparition, once fierce and unyielding, now appeared distant and unfocused. Holding his ground, the Khan remained still, his blade at the ready. Though no threat was immediately apparent, he would not be caught unawares. When the figure would speak, it would dispel any lingering uncertainty. The apparition was none other than Magnus the Red, the Crimson King. Initially, the Khan had struggled to accept the sight before him, doubting the reality of his senses. Magnus's shade revealed itself as a remnant, a fragment of the once great Primarch's psyche, a vestige of something that had been irrevocably altered. The apparition was not Magnus in its entirety, but merely a part of his essence. This aspect of Magnus explained that Prospero's devastation was a manifestation of his father's wrath, a punishment for defying the Emperor's decrees. Magnus admitted that Jaghatai had been correct in his criticisms, and that he should have imposed limits on his son's pursuits in sorcery. However, he also pointed out that the Khan had not been forced to make the same perilous bargains that the Thousand Sons had undertaken to stave off constant mutations. This divergence in their fates underscored the tragic disparity between the two legions, one driven to the brink of ruin by the warp, while the other spared of such a dire compromise. The true extent of the deception that had ensnared the Imperium was becoming increasingly apparent to the Khan. The great ocean, once presumed benign, was in fact a restless force working against humanity. The greater soul, the deeper peril, along with Horus, the mightiest of souls, faced the gravest of falls. Consumed by the warp, his very being was corroded from within, a dire testament to the all-consuming power of the Imperium. Horus, however, was not alone in his downfall. The first captain, Erebus, and Lorgar of the Wordbearers were seemingly entwined with the corrupting compromises and promises of the warp. Yet the ultimate choice lay within each mortal to reject or embrace the insidious offers. Magnus the Red had attempted to forewarn the Emperor of these dark truths. For his attempts, he was punished with the destruction of his legion and his homeworld. His downfall was a result of pride, an affliction that also ensnared Horus. The ruinous powers watched with patience, recognizing what the Primarchs had failed to see. Only the Primarchs themselves could bring about the fall of their own kind. The cosmic forces understood that the destruction of the Imperium could only be achieved by those who had helped build it. The Chaos Gods, referred to by Lorgar as Primordial annihilators perceived this truth. Most of the Primarchs, perhaps unknowingly, had already aligned themselves in the unfolding drama. Only a few remained unaligned, and these were being systematically positioned to battle amongst themselves. Jaghatai Khan was one of these uncommitted Primarchs, as he now found himself at the center of this grand and destructive scheme. The Chaos Gods remained uncertain of the White Scar's own allegiance, and thus the galaxy's gaze was fixed upon the Khan. His neutrality in the conflict rendered him a critical player in the fate of the Imperium. Jaghatai Khan now stood in the precipice of a monumental decision, which would shape the galaxy. The spectral apparition of what was left of Magnus's original soul presented him with two stark choices: remain steadfast with the crumbling remnants of his father's Imperium and attempt to repel Horus's advancing forces, or remember Horus's former self and stand alongside him to upend the complacency of the Imperium. The first option, though marked by loyalty, was fraught with challenges. The latter, while offering its own sets of merits, required aligning with his former brother, who was now knowingly shrouded in darkness. Pressed for clarity on Magnus's own allegiances, the Shade revealed the constraints of his current situation. Magnus had come to understand, perhaps more than anyone, the grim fate awaiting those who crossed over to the other side. The destruction he had labored to avoid for centuries had in part come to fruition. His relationship with his father, the Emperor, became irrevocably strained when Magnus breached the wards guarding the Emperor's clandestine webway project. This act of defiance occurred after Magnus projected his astral form into the Imperial Palace's dungeons to deliver a dire warning about Horus's corruption and insurrection directly himself. Despite this grave revelation, Jaghatai struggled to fully accept the apparition as his brother. He had come to Prospero seeking not only answers, but the counsel of his trusted friend. Magnus's inquiry into Jaghatai's eventual choice of allegiance remained pressing. Torn between the recognition of Horus's corruption and the disillusionment with the Emperor's tyranny, Jaghatai found himself in a precarious situation. He expressed his indecision, believing that choosing either side would be a betrayal. Magnus's response was resolute. Such neutrality was untenable. The time would come when Jaghatai would have to choose definitively, and their next encounter would determine where they stood as allies or adversaries. The choice remained Jaghatai's to make, and Magnus would implore him to decide wisely. The weight of this decision would not only influence the fate of the Primarchs, but the future of the Imperium and humanity itself. Jaghatai Khan now stood in the cold, dark chamber, confronting the spectral form of his brother, Magnus the Red, with deep regret. Jaghatai reflected on his absence from the Council of Nicaea, alongside Magnus and Sanguinius. He revealed that Horus had deliberately sent him away, a move now recognized as actively intentional and not a mere chance. Magnus, however, dismissed Jaghatai's lamentations, urging him to focus on the future. The Khan, his frustrations now palpable, retorted that the future seemed bleak. He and his brothers had aspired to something greater, something that would now be fractured, as reality was also fractured. Magnus conceded that Reboot Guilliman, and in his own corrupt way, Lorgar had indeed pursued greater ambitions. However, he contended that Jaghatai's focus had been limited to the hunt, the very pursuit that, while preserving his legion's purity, had kept distant from the larger unfolding events. Magnus revealed that the Crimson King had been aware all along, through the whispers of the warp. Though the whispers of the warp had eluded Jaghatai's hearing, Magnus acknowledged Jaghatai's commitment to the truth. Despite his bitter demeanor, their conversation concluded with Jaghatai affirming that he had obtained what he sought. With a final solemn gesture, he declared his enduring friendship to Magnus. The appreciation that this remnant of Magnus regarded him with was a moment of understanding. Then Jaghatai, now resolute, swung his great-bladed dao, cleaving through Magnus's spectral form. The ghost would then shatter into a myriad of fragments akin to broken glass. In the ensuing silence, Jaghatai remained motionless, sensing that any movement might disturb the fragile stillness. As he reflected in the cave's once majestic aura, which now echoed with an emptiness. Jaghatai bowed his head, the weight of his choices heavy upon his brow. The truth now clear and the path forward lain before him. The traitor had been unmasked, and duty awaited. Yet despite the clarity of his path, Jaghatai felt an immobilizing numbness. The dream of a better future had been irrevocably shattered. Back in orbit, as Jaghatai Khan covertly marshaled his forces for an assault on the 5th Legion's flagship, Terran commander Turgon Khan conveyed urgent news to Jaghatai Khan. The plan to sway Saban's allegiance had faltered. Turgon had reported that the Brotherhood of the Storm's Khan recently conferred with Jaghatai Khan, and that the situation was rapidly evolving. Hasik retained control of the Swordstorm, while Turgon Khan prepared to take command of Singzar. The key to success lay in the hands of the Warrior Lodge brothers, who now dominated the capital ships of the White Scars. Their hold would ensure that the remaining factions aligned with their cause. When the Khagan returned, he would undoubtedly see the merit of their actions. Horus and Jaghatai had once shared a similar vision. Faced with a unified fleet, the Khan would have no choice but to recognize their strategy and perceived justice. Turgon, like many of his former Lodge brothers, had long ago made his choice, dating back to the early days when the Lodges first began to exert their influence. This was an opportunity to reshape the White Scars into a formidable shock force, rivaling the renowned spear tip of the Sons of Horus, yet under the guidance of a more enlightened leadership than that of the Khan himself. The Lodges had merely accelerated this transformation. Suddenly, crucial augur readings from the Swordstorm reached every Warrior Lodge member within the 5th Legion. Elation spread amongst them as they noted that the signals on the periphery of their systems, 3 then 4 vessels, had allied with Horus, were now advancing towards the Prospero system. Their call had been answered. Meanwhile, Jaghatai Khan maneuvered his vessel, the Kiljan, into close proximity with the flagship of his legion. Positioned strategically, he orchestrated a high-risk orbital assault utilizing specially modified Sojutsu pattern void bike. Unlike conventional jet bikes, these were essentially single-pilot fighters adapted for brief forays into the void, akin to how other legions utilized specialized land speeders in atmospheric conditions. As Saban and his brotherhood launched their sudden assault on the colossal flagship, they were met with a barrage of blast fire from the Swordstorm's weapon batteries. Undeterred, they navigated their bikes through the fierce onslaught, scanning for any vulnerable entry points. Their perseverance would eventually pay off when Saban identified a solitary docking port, which was unshielded and unbarred. Leading his forces, Saban and his warriors cut through the last fire with precision, bobbing and weaving to avoid the deadly beams of fire. They speared past a row of angled torpedo launchers, converging on the exposed port. At this critical moment, they engaged their retros, executing high-speed maneuvers as they entered the Swordstorm's inertia bubble. The grav plates on their bikes whined as they adjusted to the rapid shifts in gravity, stabilizing them upon the docking bay's floor. Following their commander, the Brotherhood of the Storm advanced into the ship's corridors, as Saban's audacious assault had taken Jaghatai Khan and his allies by surprise. Reports followed in detailing the chaos erupting across the fleet as both factions clashed for control. In response, Hyask ordered the opening of a Vox link with the flotilla to prevent any of their ship from firing upon them. This was a crucial juncture. The Brotherhood, comprised of Khans and captains, senior ship officers, and mortal commanders who had been swayed and were now working to liberate the Legion from tyranny in the service to Horus, stood firm. They had no other option but to remain resolute in executing their mission. As the bridge of the Swordstorm detected signals of an incoming boarding party, Jaghatai Khan swiftly issued orders to repel the intruders. Despite the calculated risk, a single White Scar Brotherhood passed. He had hoped to avoid direct confrontation with his battle brothers. This hope, however, seemed increasingly illusory. Jaghatai Khan was perplexed by the lack of communication with the flotilla. of newly arrived trader vessels, wondering why they would remain silent, as he reassured his warriors that the moment was a test, a culmination of their efforts. The path forward was clear. No retreat for the sake of the Imperium. Meanwhile, Saban Khan and his Brotherhood of the Storm pressed deeper and deeper still into the heart of the White Scars flagship, encountering fierce resistance from a rival faction led by his former comrade, the Terran Jaghatai Khan. As they ascended a staircase to a colonnaded landing area, they found the Brotherhood of the Moon entrenched in defensive positions. The White Scars under Jaghatai had taken cover behind the curved pillars, prepared to defend the approaches to the stratagem and the bridge. The traitor attempted to reason with Saban and his forces, informing them that the bridge had been sealed. When Saban demanded the location of the Kagan, Jaghatai coldly asserted that Jaghatai Khan spoke for the Great Khan. This claim ignited Saban's fury. No one, not even the Emperor, had the authority to speak for the Great Khan. Undeterred, and now rather angry, Saban and his Brotherhood of the Storm emerged from their cover and charged up the staircase. As they plunged into the chaos of the hall, there were bolter shells erupting in a cacophony of light and sound, creating what some would deem musical violence. The conflict would escalate into a fierce battle as the two clashed for control of the flagship. As the Loyalist Brotherhood of the Storm pressed forth, they faced an unrelenting barrage of fire, advancing in loose formation. For every one of their number who was forced back, 10 more would press ahead. This clash was fierce and unyielding, as brothers in arms met in close combat, their blades flashing in a grim ballet of violence. The cacophony of bolter fire blended with a harsh crackle of energy weapons as Loyalist White Scars engaged in a brutal and calculated assault. Unlike their battles against the Greenskins, where the objective was to carve through and obliterate the enemy, the fight here was against their own kin, and the Loyalists, despite their ferocity, sought to incapacitate rather than kill whenever possible. They shattered bones, throttled, bludgeoned, and moved swiftly, maintaining their momentum through the dense press of combatants. The engagement was both intense and impersonal. The combat was close-packed and vicious, yet there was an eerie detachment to it all. There were no battle cries or war chants, only cold, methodical executions of tactics devoid of any pleasure. The clash was a dismal spectacle of cramped, relentless fighting. Both sides eschewed the flamboyance of their usual combat style, and Saban Khan pushed his force relentlessly, striving to instill greater speed and power into each of his brothers. Jaghatai Khan, in turn, drove his men into a stubborn defense, as neither side took satisfaction in the bloodshed. Despite the heavy losses inflicted by the concentrated volleys, Saban's forces advanced steadily through the narrowing corridors, their resolve unshaken. Jaghatai's defenses, worn thin by the fierce confrontation, eventually began to falter. As Saban's forces neared the observation deck, Jaghatai orchestrated a tactical withdrawal, his troops retreating swiftly and decisively as if the maneuver had been meticulously planned. Saban, perceiving his opportunity, urged his warriors to pursue the retreating enemy as they surged forwards, eager to capitalize on their perceived advantage. Saban's instincts screamed at him that they had been lured into a carefully laid trap. The realization, however, had come too late, as the Loyalist forces were already enmeshed in a snare. Saban Khan skidded to a halt, crouching low as a tempest of bolter fire erupted above him from high terraces on either side of the bridge, positioned between towering pillars and suspended platforms. A relentless barrage tore through the floor, sending debris cascading in a storm of destruction. Many of Saban's warriors were caught in the vicious fire, as their bodies were shattered in the incessant hail of bolter rounds. Those who survived scrambled for whatever cover they could. As the barrage subsided, Saban scanned the scene before him. Jaghatai's forces had consolidated their positions, forming a defensive line across servitor pits that bisected the hall. Sharpshooters stationed on the terraces above were momentarily silent, yet they remained poised, their weapons trained on the beleaguered Loyalists. Further along, heavy infantry were entrenched around the bridge's command throne, including Jaghatai Khan's own elite Kashig, clad in formidable Terminator plate. Additional defenders were strategically positioned on the observation deck and beyond, rendering the bridge heavily fortified to the immediate breach. Standing resolute, Jaghatai Khan addressed the intruding forces, urging them to surrender. Meanwhile, 4 traitor warships drifted ominously closer into the system, their fleet's markings were now unmistakably identified as belonging to the Death Guard, rather than the anticipated Sons of Horus. Their approach was unhurried and seemingly audacious, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere on the bridge. In addition, 2 more traitor warships hurtled through the outer reaches of the system at high velocity, and they emitted no discernible markings or identifications, only sub-warp signatures and the characteristic flicker of void shield activation could be perceived. The White Scars fleet lay immobilized, its ships failing to mobilize against the encroaching threat. The impending danger was undeniable, and the Loyalist forces found themselves increasingly vulnerable as the traitor forces closed in. The 5th Legion's unity fractured dramatically as hidden divisions erupted into open conflict. Jaghatai Khan reassured his men that the Kagan would return. They would not be traitors to their Gene-sire. The conflict stakes were too high for any ambiguity. Resolution was imminent. The impending clash would not cease until only one faction, traitor or loyalist, remained on the bridge. As Saban Khan readied his forces for the impending battle, a thunderous roar reverberated across the bridge. A blinding iridescent teleportation beam blazed momentarily, and when it dissipated, the scene dramatically shifted. 100 additional White Scars legionary had materialized in the ranks around the outer circle of the bridge, their bolters now trained menacingly on the command throne. At the forefront was Jaghatai Khan, encased in his master-crafted Terminator warplate, flanked by his own retinue of seasoned veterans. He commanded Helisk to stand down, declaring the attempt to redirect the 5th Legion's course had failed, and now the atmosphere was charged with a tension and heavy foreboding that could be cut with a knife. From the Voxrill, one of the commanders issued a decisive command. Saban's initial relief at Jaman's arrival quickly dissipated, as the forces now faced unevenly matched standoff, each side armed with devastating firepower, as the escalating conflict had inexorably drawn the Legion closer to its own ruin, as weapons designed for external threats were now drawn upon each other. In the midst of this maelstrom of combat, Saban Khan sprang from cover, rallying his warriors into the fray. The clash itself was rather intense and unyielding, as legionary battled the legionary in fierce commitment. The mortal crew of the flagship, overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of the conflict, sought refuge behind whatever defenses they could find. Yet one figure stood tall, a gray-haired woman in a disheveled Imperial Army general's uniform. Ignoring the chaos around her, she dashed directly towards Saban, her arms flailing desperately. Her eyes, however, revealed a different urgency. She was not merely seeking to escape, but rather striving to capture his attention. The woman had revealed that she possessed the Kagan's locus, and urgently implored Saban to escort her to the teleport platform. In a voice filled with grave urgency, she explained that she had been the one to open the docking bay doors. With a secure lock on the missing Primarch, she insisted that if Saban wished to preserve the Legion from descending into total destruction, he must get her to the teleporter controls without delay. In the devastating city, Tixa, Quinza, and the remaining Kashegan advanced towards the heart of the destruction, where their Primarch had vanished, into a massive chasm in a ruined square. As they neared their objective, the first hints of an unsettling buzz began to penetrate the atmosphere. From the very air, the warp-born insects coalesced into sight, their spectral forms forming an almost sinister inevitability. The Kashig braced themselves, knowing their weapons would be ineffective against those warp-spawned monstrosities. Amidst the chaos, Sergeant Arvida of the Thousand Suns made his presence felt. Channeling the sorcery he had taken years to master, he unleashed bolts of lightning that crackled through the ghostly forms of the insects. One of the creature's exoskeletons hardened like frozen ice, enabling Quinza to cleave through it with his power sword. The Thousand Suns sorcerer continued to cast bolts of warp fire, solidifying the otherwise ethereal creatures. Once physical, the White Scars could engage them in combat under more favorable terms. Amidst the chaos, Sergeant Arvida of the Thousand Suns was able to aid them, as the initial few insects would continue to multiply as a menacing swarm. Amongst them, more bizarre entities appeared: colossal scarabs, towering mantids, and vespid-like horrors. Arvida's relentless sorcery would continue to light up the sky, but the sheer number of adversaries proved overwhelming. The specters continued to surge from every direction as Thousand Sun and White Scars fought side by side. Yet, despite Arvida's efforts, no matter how frantic they were, no signal or location readings for the Khan were forthcoming. As the legionaries were now pressed against the encroaching swarm, Quinza roared the Khan's name, preparing to face his end with unflinching resolve. Just then, an explosion tore through the ranks of the creatures, scattering fragments high into the ruins. A towering figure would then emerge from the smoke and debris, his sword radiating with erratic energy, as though forged from molten iron. In sustained disbelief, Quinza stared at the newcomer, his breath ragged. The figure would now speak, and the identity became clear. It was a Kagan. The Primarch of the White Scars had arrived, his long Dao power blade shimmering with lethal precision. With a decisive stride, the Kagan advanced, methodically cutting through the creatures, the path to their goal now clear. In the heart of the ruined city of Tika, amidst the wreckage and desolation, Quinza and his remaining Kashig warriors gathered around the Kagan. Their Primarch, Jaghatai Khan, had attuned to the latent power coursing through him, as he was now a living conduit of the warp. A truth that defied the official accounts dispensed by Malkador the Sigillite. The warp flowed through each of the Primarchs, as vital as their lifeblood flowing through their veins. As the Kagan surveyed the scene, he inquired about the location of the sword storm. Unfortunately, the Kashig master had no answer. The Kagan's gaze shifted as he noticed the Thousand Suns legionary amongst the ranks. For a fleeting moment, he was struck by a chilling thought. Could this be Ahriman himself? The crimson armor and arcane sigils did an unsettling resemblance to Ahriman. When the Thousand Suns Astartes introduced himself, the Khan observed him closely. The psychic energy emanating from Arvida was palpable, flickering like a candle flame within the legionary. The Kagan's warriors sought confirmation from their Genesires about the insight he had gained. Jaghatai pondered briefly before responding, acknowledging that while he had acquired more understanding than before arriving on Prospero, the revelations were as foretold. Prospero bore the marks of Leman Russ's destructive wrath, confirming an ancient prophecy. Magnus too had fallen, aligning with the premonitions. Standing amidst the chaos, Jaghatai reflected on the broader implications. The true enemy was not a single traitor, but a vast and intricate web of treachery that spanned back through time. Horus, the Lord of Primarchs, was a central figure, if not the central figure, in this web, implicating them all. The relentless tide of betrayal had ensnared them, and now it surged forth to claim its final toll. As the skies overhead began to shimmer with the radiant glow of the day, a brilliant shard of light pierced through the dense smog, crackling violently as it struck the desolate stone. The Terminators, vigilant and prepared, directed their weapons towards the source of the disturbance. Quinza, unwavering in his duty, stepped protectively in front of the Khan. Jaghatai informed his warriors that he had been aware of the new presence for some time, ever since Ulnor. In fact, now at long last, this elusive entity had caught up with them. The Kashig formed a loose semicircle, ready to act upon the Khan's commands, as they awaited his signal, embodying the Khan's will with disciplined patience. Jaghatai, however, instructed his warriors to stand down, recognizing the newcomer was well beyond their collective might, for it was none other than Mortarion, the Lord of Death, Primarch of the Death Guard, who had arrived. As the residual aether burned and the ash settled, 7 figures emerged from the swirling maelstrom. 6 were rather imposing figures, clad in pallid, heavy Terminator armor, their massive forms adorned with olive green pauldrons and iron-clad intricacies, along with wielding enormous power scythes known as Man-Reapers. These were Mortarion's elite bodyguard, the Death Shroud. Towering, heavily armored warriors exuding a faint green mist from the last traces of teleportation. The 7th figure was of an altogether different stature. This figure loomed over his retinue, encased in battleplate of stark brass and a corpse-white ceramite, along with a dark green cloak that flowed through his rimmed shoulder guards, while a belt adorning with dangling skulls, both human and Xenos, held a drum-barreled pistol, its surface marked with bronze skull notches. His eyes, a piercing amber, gleamed from beneath the shadow of his tattered cowl. An ornate rebreather covered the lower half of his face, through which oily gases seeped from the seams of his battleplate. As the gas trickled down the skull-decorated surfaces and hissed upon contact with the barren soil of Prospero, Mortarion, with an imposing presence, planted the heel of his colossal scythe into the dust. The Khan looked up at the blade, known as Silence, the most feared, infamous Man-Reapers. Soon after this teleportation, Mortarion began elucidating the purpose behind his sudden arrival. He confided to Jaghatai that he sought him out due to the significant changes in their circumstances. It became clearer to the Khan that his brother was intent on recruiting him to the traitorous factions. Jaghatai regarded Mortarion with a watchful eye. His brother was inscrutable. The Khan kept his blade unsheathed, loosely held at his side, his gaze steady on the evolving form before him. The physical transformation of Mortarion was striking. His presence exuded a deeper menace, and his flesh was now pallid, as his posture was more stooped. The aura of intimidation surrounding him had intensified. Back on Ulnar, even amidst their greatest triumphs, Mortarion had not commanded such a formidable presence. It was evident that his power had grown significantly since then. Jaghatai commanded Mortarion to articulate his purpose for being in the ruins of Prospero, and the Khan deduced that Mortarion had not been dispatched by Horus himself, but had come driven by his own motivations and agenda. Mortarion dismissed Jaghatai's deduction with a casual shrug, yet the Khan pressed on. Mortarion's efforts were now focused on persuading his brother to embrace Horus's vision for the galaxy, unshackled from the Emperor's edict. The Khan was not easily deceived. He understood that this new galaxy would be governed by Horus, the so-called champion and sacrificial monarch. Mortarion conceded that Horus might either burn himself out in the struggle to reach Terra, or he might not succeed at all. Regardless, Mortarion suggested that there would be opportunities for others to ascend power in the ensuing galactic order. Mortarion reproached Jaghatai for his allegiance to Sanguinius and Magnus, lamenting that the fact that the three brothers had been ensnared further by the Emperor's hypocrisy. According to Mortarion, their father had attempted to ignore the warp, despite being deeply enmeshed in its corrupting influence. Mortarion argued that it should have been sealed off and discarded. Despite his brother's passionate rhetoric, Jaghatai remained unconvinced. He had witnessed the consequences of Mortarion's path all too clearly. Mortarion's ambitions had never been cloaked in secrecy. Jaghatai perceived them with clarity. The trajectory which Mortarion envisioned first would be to subdue the sorcerers, silence the witches, expel them, and governance would then fall on the untainted, the uncorrupted. This was Mortarion's grand scheme, a vision he had previously shared with Jaghatai on Ulnar. At the time, the Khan had dismissed these declarations as mere bluster, but now he understood that Mortarion's threats were anything but empty. Yet Mortarion's plans had unraveled. Despite his efforts and the Emperor's edicts of Nicaea, which outlawed sorcery and disbanded the librarius of the legions, the ranks of the traitors had only swollen with more sorcerers. Horus had supported them, and Lorgar had introduced them to new arcane practices. If Magnus had not yet committed to one side of the conflict, he would soon make his choice, leaving Mortarion increasingly isolated. The eradication of the librarians had merely led to the unchecked proliferation of sorcery amongst the traders. Jaghatai had seen the broader picture as Magnus had revealed it to him. The Khan warned Mortarion that while his legion might appear free from the warp's taint for the moment, the changes were imminent. Mortarion had forged pacts with the masters of the Imperium, and they would soon come to collect their due. Mortarion revealed that his quest was driven by desperation. He had exhausted his alliances and sought Jaghatai's aid against the Aether Weavers, knowing full well that neither Angron nor Conrad would support him. The Khan regarded Mortarion with disdain. His brother had embraced treachery and found it a bitter harvest. Jaghatai had no intention of being dragged into Mortarion's downfall. Mortarion's fate was his own. Angered by this response, Mortarion presented Jaghatai with a stark choice. Half of the White Scars Legion had already aligned with Horus, and the remainder would follow the Khagan's lead. Their father's era was ending, and Jaghatai could either align himself with the emerging order or be swept aside by it. The Khan's reply was a cold, imperious smile, a gesture of unending contempt. He refused to accept any new emperor, whether himself or his brother. Jaghatai explained that neither he nor Mortarion were destined to rule the galaxy. They were not empire builders, but outriders. Mortarion resented his role, while Jaghatai embraced his. In a storm of rage, Mortarion retreated, the scythe silence igniting with a crackling energy. The Death Shroud, Mortarion's elite bodyguard, lowered their scythes into a combat-ready stance. Behind the Khan, the Kashig pointed their blades, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The air thick with tension as Jaghatai and Mortarion braced themselves for a decisive duel. The two Primarchs began to circle one another, each ready to engage in a battle that would determine their fates. Speed versus raw power. Agility versus resilience. It was a contrast of formidable extremes. While the Khan's agility was unmatched, Mortarion's sheer strength was overwhelming, nearly unmatched within all but a handful of Primarchs. Jaghatai suspected that only Ferrus Manus amongst his brothers could have easily stood up to Mortarion's conventional might. The clash was intense. Mortarion absorbed each strike with tenacity, as the Khan's blows were mere irritations. The Death Guard's renowned resilience was now on full display, and Mortarion withstood and returned the assault with relentless force. The Death Shroud would mirror their master's unyielding nature, engaging the White Scars amidst the debris of their surroundings. As the battle raged on, the battlefield was strewn with the forms of fallen warriors, their bodies covered in layers of dust. The fighting was unrelenting, each side determined to prevail. Despite his incredible speed and prowess, the Khan began to feel the effects of fatigue, a situation he had rarely experienced in his long combat career. The physical toll extracted by Mortarion's relentless assault was profound. Yet Mortarion was not without his own strain. Blood stained his sallow complexion, and his rebreather wheezed as he labored to draw breath. Mortarion would now charge, wielding his scythe like a halberd, and driving the hilt into the Khan's midsection. The force of the blow sent Jaghatai reeling, but Mortarion would press on his advantage, delivering a series of brutal, earth-shattering strikes. The Khan would then struggle to endure the onslaught, each impacting blow jolting him with bone-jarring force. They clashed with raw defiance. Their conflict was a brutal testament to each other's indomitable will. As the battle between the two Primarchs reached its zenith, fragments of armor erupted like shrapnel. Explosions of gas from Mortarion's vials created blinding flashes, their sharp, acid fumes adding to the chaos. Blood splattered across both combatants, staining their armor and maligning their blades. The dark droplets lingered in a way reminiscent to spilled wine. Amidst the fury, the Khan summoned a final surge of energy, struggling to maintain his position. He would pant heavily, his dao poised for a decisive thrust, as he had the strength for one more perfect strike. But Mortarion remained motionless, as if suddenly attuned to some unseen signal. The Lord of Death's scythe fell into a defensive guard. A thin, rattling cough emerged from Mortarion's rebreather. An exhausted almost derisive chuckle. "So the choice has been made," he remarked. Mortarion revealed that their starships had engaged in battle, a grim turn of events that contradicted the assurances given by the White Scars warrior lodges. The Death Lord was unwilling to sacrifice his fleet in this confrontation. As the dust swirled around them, the shimmering coils of marsh green teleportation energy began to manifest. With a mocking salute, Mortarion prepared to withdraw. Suddenly, beams of harsh, focused light pierced the sky, crashing through the cloud cover and striking the heart of the pyramid, tearing through the very area of their conflict. As the Khan lunged forwards, the scene shifted in a heart-stopping instant. The Death Lord and his retinue were abruptly engulfed in a swirling vortex of warp energy. The very essence of the world seemed to howl in their wake, as the winds screamed and ash swirled, along with lightning forking violently across the tumultuous sky. Jaghatai, propelled by the momentum of his final thrust, staggered through the void, left by his vanishing foe. In the aftermath, Quinza stood alone, his blades still unsullied by blood. The Thousand Suns legionary and 5 Kishag remained, their expressions etched with the same grim frustration that plagued their lord. Enraged by the sudden and incomplete nature of their hunt, the Khan's anger flared. His quarry had been wrestled from him, his kill snatched away. Quinza lowered his weapons, his silence a stark contrast to the frantic clicks emanating from his helm as he attempted to establish contact with the White Scars warships in orbit. The Khan now turned to Arvida and issued a terse command. He needed to be extracted from Prospero. Arvida was aware of the difficulties ahead, cautioned that the process would be arduous. His psychic powers were fleeting, and he hoped that their distress signals would be noticed by vigilant eyes. Summoning every ounce of his remaining strength, Arvida conjured a blinding silvery light from his hands. The brilliance was so intense that it bordered on the painful. With a deliberate motion, he directed his hands towards the sky, releasing the searing column of electric white energy that surged upwards, erupting into the rolling heavens. The Khan's gaze followed the ascending beam, hoping fervently that the signal would pierce through the chaos and reach their rescuers. The chaos aboard the bridge of the White Scars flagship had Saban Khan face an agonizing choice. He was torn between continuing the fight alongside his brothers or heeding the desperate pleas of a mortal woman. Initially, his instincts were to brush her aside and engage the enemy, but desperation etched into her gray-haired face halted him, his gaze flickering between the teleportation platform and the pleading woman, clad in a tattered Imperial Army uniform, determined his act. Saban seized her in his arms and bolted away from the platform. As he charged across the bridge, he was struck by multiple stray bolts, each impact driving him further into an agonizing pain. Yet he pushed on, driven by sheer will. When the platform columns began to ascend, Saban thrust the woman clear, ensuring his fallen body would not crush her. She scrambled to safety, diving into the relative refuge inside the chamber's inner workings as bolts continued to pelt the columns. She frantically input a series of codes, causing the teleportation apparatus to hum with intensifying energy. In a blink of an eye, a blinding burst of light erupted between Saban and the woman. A resounding bang reverberated across the bridge, engulfing the scene in a seething maelstrom of energy. Gradually, the figures emerged from this storm, White Scars clad in Terminator army alongside a red armored Space Marine legionary. Clearly exhausted, dominating the scene, however, was a towering silhouette in ornate armor, his cloak in tatters, his face a mask of severe burns and deep cuts. Jaghatai Khan had emerged from the dissipating light, his gaze heavy with disdain as it swept through the tumult of the bridge. The bridge would remain a maelstrom of conflict, with battle brothers clashing in a frenzy of battle cries and gunfire. Jaghatai descended from the platform, flanked by his Kashig. Ahead, the command hall was engulfed in combat, with many warriors momentarily distracted by the teleportation flare amidst the din of battle. Yet others remained locked in their ferocious struggle, oblivious to the shifting tides of the battle that surrounded them. In the heart of this chaos, warriors from his own legion clashed violently with each other. Jaghatai Khan could not escape the resonance of Mortarian's words. Half your legion has already declared for Horus. His gaze swept across the battlefield, finally settling on the command throne, where the conflict was at its fiercest. Amidst the tumult, he recognized his Silk Nayan Khan, entrenched at the dais, fiercely battling against Jamalan's forces. The Khan, his body battered and his dhow still slick with Mortarian's blood, pressed into the maelstrom of combat, accompanied by his bodyguard, who formed a protective barrier around their primarch. Jaghatai carved a bloody path through the turmoil. His presence seemed to break the fervored intensity of the fighting. As warriors around him ceased their duels, their attention now drawn by the sight of their beleaguered primarch, the relentless din of bolter fire would continue to gradually become more dim. Helisk awaited him on the throne of the bridge, and the bridge itself would fall into silence. Their weapons remained poised, eyes fixated on the command dais. The Khan demanded to know what madness Helisk had unleashed. Helisk responded to him that his actions were intended for the betterment of the White Scars Legion. The Khan, coldly addressing the situation, pointedly questioned whether Helisk had anticipated his return when he orchestrated his coup. Did he also intend to keep the Kagan away until he secured control of the fleet? The response Jaghatai received was that Helisk had merely wished for the reunion between his primarch and Horus, clinging to the hope that the whispers of the faithless would not prevail. The Khan, incredulous, challenged Helisk's claim. How could he denounce his opponents as faithless when it was he who had sown discord and betrayed his primarch, his gene-sire? Helisk conceded that his error had been made, but insisted that he and his warrior lodge brothers had discerned the truth. The War Master's call was the one that they were bound to follow, as had always been their tradition. The Khan retorted that they had been deceived by Horus. As Helisk attempted to justify his actions, the Khan's fury erupted. Raising his blade in a visceral display, he confronted Helisk's treachery, perhaps instinctively, perhaps misguidedly, or driven by a warped sense of righteousness. Helisk raised his own blade. With a sudden and decisive motion, Jaghatai Khan launched himself at his gene son, his dhow slicing through the air with lethal intent. The two blades clashed in a violent intersection of metal as the Khan's dhow met Helisk's tulwar with a resounding impact. In a fluid and practiced maneuver, Jaghatai disarmed the Nayan Khan, wrenching the tulwar from his grasp and thrusting the point of his dhow deep into Helisk's midriff. The strike was a model of perfection, piercing through the traitor's Terminator armor with a resounding crack as the disruptor field discharged. The impact of the blow rendered Helisk immobile, his body now locked in a rigid posture as the searing energies of the blade coursed through him, causing an agonizing paralysis. Jaghatai, with a display of formidable strength, lifted Helisk off the ground with one hand, his blade still thrust in the man's abdomen, holding him suspended until their faces were aligned. The dhow maintained its grip, ensuring Helisk remained in position, unable to counter. With a grimace, Jaghatai Khan reached for Helisk's helm and wrenched it free with his hand, tearing it from his head, casting it disdainfully into the floor. The two's eyes met. Jaghatai declared Helisk's ignorance of the truth evident. Had Helisk followed the orders given by the Khan, Jaghatai would have revealed it to him. Instead, the Khan made it clear that the 5th Legion belonged solely to him, governed by his authority alone. This principle had been established since their first campaign together, and no cosmic force, whether it be Horus or the Emperor, could alter that reality. Helisk had been granted liberties beyond that of any other Space Marine Legion Lord would tolerate, but he repaid his trust with betrayal and defiance. Consequently, he would be punished for his arrogance. Jaghatai cast Helisk's body aside with disdain. As it hurtled through the air, it clashed against the command throne of the warship, splitting it lengthwise before tumbling down the steps. Quinza approached, weapons drawn, but Helisk remained motionless, his defiance extinguished. Turning away, Jaghatai's rage now simmered, entwined with the profound grief of betrayal from his once trusted commander. For a fleeting moment, he envisioned a sweeping retribution against his disloyal gene progeny, as though channeling the wrath of an ancient, vengeful deity. Yet his gaze was drawn upwards towards the observation arch, and to the vast view of Prospero's orbital space. In the void, distant flashes of light signaled a grim rally of war, as ships would engage in combat, lances firing and shields failing. Time was running short, and the Khan's voice rang out with a cry for reckoning to the gathered forces. But for now, the battle demanded his immediate attention, and so would begin the second battle of Prospero.